American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations.
Iraq's army is defeated. Our military objectives are met.
To understand why George Bush Jr. invaded Iraq, we must first return to another war that took place 10 years earlier, led by George Bush Sr. in the same desert when the same dictator, Saddam Hussein, decided to attack his rich neighbor, Kuwait. General Colin Powell, at the head of an international coalition, drove back the Iraqi army in a few hours. When the ceasefire was signed, draconian sanctions were imposed on Saddam Hussein. But George Bush Sr. refused to order American troops to enter Iraq, and Saddam's power remained intact.
The coalition forces did not go to Baghdad. The mother of all battles to Saddam Hussein was the battle after Iraq's forces were thrown out of Kuwait, when, as Saddam viewed it, he was fighting the coalition to deter them from marching on Baghdad. And he won that battle, in his view.
The victory had a bitter aftertaste for men like Paul Wolfowitz, Chief of Staff to Dick Cheney, the Secretary of Defense. Wolfowitz headed a group of neoconservatives that had been distanced from power by Democrat President Bill Clinton. They had one obsession: to overthrow Saddam. Their doctrine was simple: America had won the Cold War and must now recreate the world in its own image. Known as the Prince of Darkness, the eminence grise of the movement was Richard Pearl.
Neoconservatives, I think by and large, believe that the world is safer when there are fewer dictatorships in it. And certainly when there are fewer places prepared to open their doors to terrorist organizations.
As early as 1997, the Neocons had created a project for a new American century. One of their reports, highly critical of the Clinton government, judged it would take an event as catastrophic as Pearl Harbor to shake America from its complacency and allow it to take on its role as world hyperpower. Under pressure from the group, President Clinton signed the Iraq Liberation Act. The overthrow of Saddam Hussein was now written into American law, and $100 million were freed up for the purpose. But the neoconservatives had to wait for George Bush Jr. to occupy the White House before they could make their great comeback.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
Richard Clarke had been on the White House National Security Council since the first Bush administration.
And the people who came in with Bush were people who had served his father.
He was assisted, of course, by the fact that he had assembled a very experienced team. Vice President Cheney, who had been a White House Chief of Staff, a Secretary of Defense, Colin Powell, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, one of the true superstars, military superstars, as Secretary of State, and of course Don Rumsfeld as Secretary of Defense.
Rumsfeld was flanked by Paul Wolfowitz, who made his comeback as Undersecretary of Defense.
I think the team that came in with President Bush in 2001 was highly experienced in national security. The only problem with that was their experience was 8 years old.
Ex-helicopter pilot Larry Wilkerson was made Colin Powell's Chief of Staff.
We had a vice president who had risen to a point where he could not be president, so he decided he'd do it through the back door. And we had a Secretary of State who thought he was going to be the foreign policy guru of this naive president, this lacking bona fides president, and all these people ran into each other like speeding trains in the night, 800-pound gorillas.
They still had the mindset from the Cold War. They wanted to talk about Russia, and They wanted to talk about Iraq, which was, in their minds, unfinished business from the last Bush, from the last Republican administration. Well, throughout the year prior to 9/11, they had a lot of meetings about Iraq. And I think they were split, frankly. I think there were people who wanted to do something to take the initiative to go to war with Iraq or to provoke Iraq into a war. And there were others who were more cautious.
In Paris, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs did not consider Iraq a threat. The Quai d'Orsay was more concerned about other countries, such as Iran. Rumors of war had not yet crossed the Atlantic.
Il y a à l'arrière-plan de l'équipe Bush qui est arrivée au pouvoir une doctrine idéologique, qui est la doctrine néoconservatrice, qui plaide pour un renversement par la force des régimes dictatoriaux au Moyen-Orient, pour avoir un effet domino et une démocratie qui s'installe dans l'ensemble des pays du Proche et du Moyen-Orient.
You know, frankly, it's a little bit arrogant to think that you can change the Arab world into being something different than it has ever been, based on American philosophy, when you don't understand anything about the Arab culture or history. The Arab world can someday become democratic, but not at the point of an American bayonet. Well, I think September 11th put all of us into a trauma, into a different mindset. And we had actually looked down the barrel of the gun. Many of us thought we were going to die that day. And many of our friends did die that day.
Remember, I'm old enough to have been a memory age at the time of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. And it was a similar feeling. The anger was, who did this? And we will get them.
I happened to be in CIA headquarters that day. I was in fact surprised that the headquarters was not a target. Well, it was clear instantaneously that we were at war.
During the following days, America prepared to launch an operation in Afghanistan against Osama bin Laden, the brain behind the terrorist attacks. But in the White House, Dick Clark realized that this was only a prelude to the main war in view. He could hardly believe his ears.
On September 11th, Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, says to the President in my presence, now we can do Iraq. The people who wanted to go immediately after Iraq, that group was led by the Deputy Defense Minister, Paul Wolfowitz. I think Rumsfeld, his boss, let him make his case. Rumsfeld stood back a little from it, but Rumsfeld wanted to do Iraq. And I was stunned. I didn't see what, if anything, Iraq had to do with it. And initially I thought perhaps Rumsfeld was joking, because what he said was, well, yes, we can go into Afghanistan, yes, we can bomb Afghanistan, but there aren't enough targets there. And I thought, aren't enough targets? Aren't enough targets for what? I mean, what kind of joke is that? That we need to bomb a lot of things to prove after 9/11 that we're still a big, powerful country? I didn't quite get what he had in mind. And the President said to me, I believe it was on the 12th, I want you to make sure that you get all the evidence of Iraqi involvement. The impression he left with me was, you know, I want you to find the connection that Saddam, he kept saying Saddam.
A split appeared within the government. Doves on one side, hawks on the other. The latter saw the acts of September 11 as the ultimate justification for attacking regimes that harbored terrorists. Iraq was now literally in the firing line.
We believed that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. We knew he hated the United States. We knew that he had cheered on 9/11.
Caught unawares by the catastrophe, the Bush administration prepared frantically against the possibility of further attacks.
The intelligence community's advice to the president was, Mr. President, this is the first of a wave of attacks. There will be more. Those mass casualty attacks could include weapons of mass destruction. Less the nuclear, more concern about chemical and particularly biological.
Colin Powell pretended to be unaware of his colleagues' intentions, believing he could use his influence to gain time.
I think the people on the other side were led by Colin Powell. General Powell was then the Secretary of State. And he didn't see any connection with Iraq in 9/11, and we talked about it. And he wanted to slow roll this desire to go to war with Iraq, I think in the hope that it would go away. On September 12th, Saddam Hussein met with his Revolutionary Council. And well, now that the Americans have been attacked by the Al-Qaeda people, now we and the Americans can be allies because we're both against Al-Qaeda. How the same set of facts could cause two leaders of two countries to come to so remarkably different conclusions in an era of mass communications where we all have access to the same information. It's really quite remarkable.
But for the neocons, Iraq seemed the ideal laboratory to put their theories to the test. The fact that Saddam Hussein reigned over a secular regime light years from the fundamentalist beliefs of Al-Qaeda was not even taken into account.
And the issue that became an obsession with the administration was simply this: who could commit another act of terror, this time with weapons of mass destruction, and what can we do to prevent it?
The United States was attacked by Al-Qaeda, and therefore our response is to go invade Iraq. So I said, unfortunately, to these cabinet members, I said, you know, this is the equivalent of Franklin Roosevelt responding to Pearl Harbor by invading Mexico.
January 2002, the ritual State of the Union address.
Chairman Hamid Karzai.
The Afghanistan campaign had been a great success, and the new President Hamid Karzai was guest of honor. Bush took the opportunity to designate a new enemy, Iraq.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world by seeking weapons of mass destruction.
Bush used the term weapons of mass destruction for the first time. The war of words had begun, and so had the countdown to the real hostilities.
Giving them the means.
I felt I was inside a beast. I felt I was inside a government, a machine that was about to make a terrible mistake that would really hurt the world.
A race for war was underway, aided by America's tireless ally and accomplice, Great Britain. Jack Straw was Tony Blair's foreign secretary.
The idea that something may happen over Iraq came up in early 2002. And certainly by February, March, there was quite a lot of discussion in Washington and discussion between us and Washington.
In the months following the terrorist attacks on New York, the British government learned that military action against Iraq was in preparation. In this document from December 2001, Blair accepts that the invasion is a fait accompli. Justification, the document points out, could be constructed around weapons of mass destruction, though it would be threadbare. Saying no to America was never considered an option, even though from the outset Tony Blair made it clear that he would do nothing without the backing of the United Nations.
And so I started to look for the evidence that politicians were using when they were making claims about Iraq. And it was in that gap between the political statement and the evidence that they were drawing upon that I found a source of curiosity, a wonder of why there was this mismatch between the evidence and the rhetoric.
In a message addressed to Blair before his visit to America, Jack Straw drew his attention to the fact that there was no direct link between Iraq and Al-Qaeda. But when Prime Minister Blair visited the Bush ranch, officially for a consultation between two heads of state, he was, in fact, picking up his battle orders. That is the way this special relationship works.
There's a real neurosis inside the British system, not to separate ourselves from the United States, but it does mean the starting point is alliance with the US, and where there are disagreements, insofar as it's possible, you keep them within the family.
In this document from the Prime Minister's office, Tony Blair enjoins one of his advisors to reorder government narrative in order to help American propaganda.
The intelligence assessments that were not made public until a few years after the invasion had actually occurred are filled with caveats. They're filled with statements of what they don't actually know.
The subtlety of intelligence you can't really convey to a public, and I felt that it was a mistake for us to seek to rely on intelligence.
Good morning. Morning after September the 11th.
A parliamentary inquiry was to discover only much later that on several occasions, Tony Blair tried to force the hand of his Attorney General, Lord Goldsmith, to make him declare an invasion legal. This document, in which Goldsmith refuses yet again to give in to the Prime Minister's demands, bears a furious annotation in the margin. I just don't understand this. Philip Sands, an international lawyer, has written a book on the subject of Tony Blair's legal manipulations.
He stood up and he told the British people that there was evidence and intelligence that Saddam's regime had weapons of mass destruction. Not true. The second misrepresentation was that the Attorney General had told him that the use of force was unequivocally legal. Not true. So it gets pretty serious when a Prime Minister misleads his own public in relation to intelligence and legal advice.
Lord Goldsmith held his ground until the trip to America, where he met his American counterparts, the same men who a few days earlier had authorized the use of torture by the American army. On his return to England, Goldsmith finally gave in to Blair's demands. To sell the idea of war, Blair stepped up the number of misleading shock declarations to the press, as we see from this headline in one of Britain's most popular papers. Nothing works quite like fear. In Afghanistan, the Taliban regime crumbled in a matter of weeks. But that did not mean that the war was over. Osama bin Laden was still on the loose, and American soldiers were dying every day. In the United States, patriotism is always unquestioned. Fertile soil for the White House in its effort to win the hearts and minds of the American nation and gain their support for a new war.
What was different about this war, as far as propaganda was concerned, was the people in the White House, especially with a good political sense, realized that a war of aggression was so contrary to American tradition that a long sales campaign would be needed to muster the support for it.
Andrew Card, Bush's chief of staff, started a vigorous media offensive. He had come to politics from marketing at General Motors. He knew you don't launch a new product in August. And with the support of senior officials, prepared the opening of the campaign for the anniversary of 9/11. The message was unstated, but the propaganda perfect. And it was Dick Cheney who would first give it voice.
9/11 and its aftermath awakened this nation to danger, to the true ambitions of the global terror network. Simply stated, there is no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction. There is no doubt that he is amassing them to use against our friends, against our allies, and against us.
On September 11, the president himself addressed the nation.
And we will not allow any terrorist or tyrant to threaten civilization with weapons of mass murder.
The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Mr. George W. Bush, President of the United States of America.
On the following day, September 12th, he spoke to the whole world.
Mr. Secretary General, Mr. President, distinguished delegates.
N'oubliez pas, intervention de George Bush à l'Assemblée générale des Nations Unies à la rentrée 2002. Là, il nous piège tous. On s'attend à ce qu'ils disent, écoutez, les Nations Unies, vous êtes très sympathiques, mais nous, on est décidés à aller en guerre, donc on ira quoi qu'il arrive. Il ne dit pas ça.
But the purposes of the United States should not be doubted. The Security Council resolutions will be enforced.
Il chante les louanges des Nations Unies.
My nation will work with the UN Security Council to meet our common challenge.
Il explique qu'il va passer par les Nations Unies pour obtenir l'aval en droit d'une intervention militaire en Irak. Alors bien sûr que pour George Bush, tout ça était un pur calcul et une façon de légitimer une action qui de toute façon était prévue longtemps à l'avance. Il voulait juste l'estampille, labelliser Nations Unies.
Saddam Hussein's regime is a grave and gathering danger. To suggest otherwise is to hope against the evidence in deploying the most terrible weapons. Our own
Not content with tricking the UN and its frontline members of the Security Council, Bush directly threatened Iraq.
And if an emboldened regime were to supply these weapons to terrorist allies, then the attacks of September the 11th would be a prelude to far greater horrors.
The British had already decided which side they were on. It was up to France to become the symbol of resistance in the new debate. And American public opinion was about to become the object of new coercion.
So they begin preparing public opinion, equating Iraq with Afghanistan. They want the public to see it all of a piece.
As Mr. Wolfowitz conceded in an unguarded comment, the weapons issue was just something that people in government could agree on as a rationale for the war.
A kind of game of mirrors was put in place, repeatedly telling and showing Americans that invasion was a necessity.
There is no more sacred decision a president and his cabinet will take than sending soldiers into war to kill and to die in your country's name. So the first thought that comes to mind is not they're lying. They had made their case very skillfully in their propaganda, in selling the war to the American people, and the first level of that sales package, if you will, was the nuclear threat.
The evidence indicates that Iraq is reconstituting its nuclear weapons program. Saddam Hussein has held numerous meetings with Iraqi nuclear scientists, a group he calls his nuclear mujahideen, his nuclear holy warriors.
and the old threat of nuclear attack was wheeled out for the purpose.
The problem here is that there will always be some uncertainty about how quickly he can acquire a nuclear weapon, but we don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud.
Facing clear evidence of peril, we cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun, that could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Does he have nuclear weapons? Is there a smoking gun here?
The smoking gun is an interesting phrase.
And that certainly gets the public's attention, doesn't it?
The words bearing the essential themes were repeated again and again. The orchestration was varied, but the melody simple and effective.
Iraq is going to cooperate.
This is about the disarmament of Iraq, not about weapons inspectors hunting and pecking all over the country.
Time is running out, and we just can't keep hunting and pecking.
They were very well organized, they were very articulate, and they were unrelenting. It was constant.
As the president has said, the one option that we do not have is to do nothing.
The president has, I think, put it exactly right. He has said that the one choice we don't have is to do nothing.
As the president has said, and as Prime Minister Blair said yesterday, doing nothing is no longer an option.
But more than repetition was needed to convince the public. There were other vital ingredients: confusion and doubt.
We know of certain knowledge that we know these things. We know them. We also know there's a category of things we don't know. And then we don't even know a category of things that we don't know.
The White House also played a more subtle game. False information was leaked to distinguished journalists. In September, Judith Miller, a top reporter for the New York Times, published a scoop. Iraq was procuring metal tubing for the enrichment of uranium. The source of the leak? A member of the White House team who had chosen the New York Times because of its reliability.
And then, very quickly, they would send their spokesman, their trained and dedicated spokesman, out to again flood the screens and the radio with saying, well, as this newspaper said just the other day.
This is, and I want to attribute to the Times, I don't want to talk about, obviously, specific intelligence sources, but reporting just this morning that he is still trying to acquire, for example, some of the specialized aluminum tubing one needs to develop centrifuges that would give you an enrichment capability.
In the abstract, this was the thing of beauty of public relations and manipulation of public opinion.
To know what the defector al-Qarari, a former brigadier general in the Iraqi intelligence service, told me is that these guys, there are 1,200 in all.
These informers did not stop at feeding incorrect information to the media. They also produced false witnesses, so-called deserters from Saddam's army.
The defector is telling Moussawi that in order to evade the UN inspectors, Saddam Hussein put his...
They fostered the belief that the Iraqi dictator possessed weapons of mass destruction, that he was financing terrorist networks, and was seeking to produce a nuclear arsenal. Everyone, or almost, was taken in.
In Iraq's ruthless intelligence service, the Mukhabarat.
No matter how you framed it, it was going to be perceived as you saying, the President of the United States is not telling the truth, i.e., we hate to use lying as a word. It's one of those words that journalists are very reluctant to. But when you say the president's not telling the truth, you're saying your president is a liar. Your vice president's a liar. Your secretary of state's a liar. Or Mr. Journalist, who the hell are you to question this?
How can you not say the president is lying if you know the president is lying?
John Walcott was chief editor of Knight Ridder, one of the only Washington press groups that dared counter the official version of the facts.
Here's where it comes down now, as I look back. If you take the metro from here, we're in downtown Washington, and if you take it to the Pentagon, where the Department of Defense is based, it comes out of the ground, briefly, at Arlington National Cemetery. And you look out of the window of that train, and you see row upon row of white crosses. Some that are there from Iraq, some thousands. And I can look out at those crosses from the train and say, I tried. I did my best before you were sent to war to ask whether or not the cause was truthful. We got a lot of pushback from people quite high up in the administration who accused us of, at one point in one fairly heated conversation, of treason. You know, if you contradict what the president or the vice president or the Defense Department is saying, that somehow is treasonous. And they tried to play that card. And they played the access card.
5, 6, 7, 8, stop the bombing, stop the hate. 6, 7, 8.
The popular media preferred the official version, rarely contradicted or verified, to what was written on the slogans carried at the anti-war demonstrations.
You know, we like to talk in journalism, and there's journalistic courage. We probably talk too much about it and don't do enough of it. But yes, it takes guts. It takes courage to say, I don't care what the herd is doing. I have questions about this.
Almost 70% of the American people thought Saddam Hussein had something to do with 9/11 before we attacked Iraq. I mean, it was masterful propaganda, okay?
After September 11, the government knew that above all else, the public had to be reassured. The people would not oppose a president once he was at war, but to go into Iraq, a vote of Congress was needed, and to win it, they would need more than a few leaks to the press. Vice President Dick Cheney decided to make a personal visit to the CIA to put pressure on agency analysts. He needed the information they held to be of use to him.
Cheney hated the CIA. They wouldn't bend on ties between Iraq and Al-Qaeda. They resisted for too long this notion of weapons of mass destruction, and he was always suspicious that they were trying to get him.
Cheney did not trust George Tenet, the head of what is the largest intelligence service in the world. But Tenet, a renegade from the Clinton administration, was very careful to tell his bosses what they wanted to hear.
That doesn't work, because if you size up your director as a guy who's willing to smell the prevailing winds, you know, and adjust his briefings accordingly, then how are you going to be completely free to tell the president or the vice president, secretary of state, well, that's not the way it is, sir?
For the first time in the history of the United States, a vice president rifled through CIA files to see what could be of use to him.
And I'm so interested that I, powerful vice president, am going to come out and make visits to your place. That shows you how important this is to me. That was the message. And you know, analysts, and this gets more into the question of subtleties of influence, you know. Analysts crave FaceTime with someone as powerful as the vice president, you know. I mean, I talked to one or two of the people from the Counterterror Center who was involved in some of these meetings. Oh, we had all this time with Dick Cheney, the vice president, you know. It went fine as far as they were concerned.
The sacred wall that until now had assured the independence of intelligence communication was breached. Dick Cheney had got what he came for. Following his much contested report in which Iraq was identified as an immediate threat to the security of the US, Congress nonetheless authorized the president to go to war.
196, the nays are 133. The joint resolution is passed without objection.
The vote had been a success, but government infighting intensified. Cheney and Rumsfeld on one side, Powell and Tenet on the other. No one trusted anyone, and each interfered in the other's affairs.
It was so bad by that time that people were referring to the vice president's office as the Gestapo, the Nazis. People were referring to Rumsfeld and the alliance between Rumsfeld and Cheney as the deadly duo, the devil's duo.
To crown it all, on November 8, 2002, in New York, the UN Security Council once more slowed the White House down. Hands were raised in a unanimous vote for Resolution 1441.
If Iraq's defiance continues, however,
the Security Council must face its responsibilities.
It was a defeat for the United States. War seemed to have been averted, and it was back to diplomacy. For Dick Cheney, it was vital to retaliate. His bureau had been exploring new avenues for several months.
These reports were floating around the intelligence community, probably from the end of 2001, a month or two after 9/11.
This time, the CIA presented Dick Cheney's office with some contracts. They came from Europe and seemed to prove that Iraq had purchased several tons of uranium from Niger. CIA Specialist on Nuclear Affairs Valerie Plame Wilson was given the job of checking the veracity of the documents.
If the White House calls and it's in the very essence of the CIA to respond to senior policymakers.
However, these documents had immediately aroused the suspicions of world specialists.
These were fabricated documents that came out of the Italian service, SISMI, but they were bought by SISMI from a notorious fabricator who had been selling so-called secrets and documents to various European countries, including the French.
The same documents appeared on the desks of the most senior state officials in France. The Paris government was far from convinced.
Je dis très clairement qu'on a voulu faire croire aux autorités politiques françaises, par tous les moyens, y compris la manipulation de documents officiels, qu'il y avait réellement des armes de destruction massive en Irak. Et je peux témoigner que j'ai reçu dans mon bureau, de la part de services étrangers alliés, des documents établissant l'existence d'armes de destruction massive en Irak qui étaient des faux. Et les personnes qui m'ont fourni ces documents ne pouvaient pas ignorer que c'était des faux.
The CIA decided to send Valerie's husband, Joe Wilson, a top specialist on Africa, to investigate in Niger.
My value added was I had a sense of what was going on the ground, and I had the contacts on the ground. I knew who to go talk to.
Joe Wilson tried to find out more about these supposed sales.
I saw the former Prime Minister, I saw the former Minister of Mines, I saw a number of other officials. It would have represented, I think, something in the order of a 40% increase in the production at that time, which would have meant 40% more trucks, 40% more barrels. It would have been very difficult, I think, to hide that from anybody.
He returned empty-handed, made a report of his trip to the CIA, and went back to his job. A few weeks later, President Bush affirmed the sale had taken place in his State of the Union address.
Failure. The British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa.
These 16 words constituted a vulgar lie, but the White House was beyond caring. They were too busy implicating their allies in the war.
Cataloged other methods used in the torture chambers of Iraq. International human rights groups.
In February, while military preparations were at their most intense, the diplomatic situation was once more in deadlock. Bush realized that despite all his efforts, he was not convincing the world. He had to go for bust. But how?
I know what we do. There's only one of us that has any credibility left, and that's Colin. Yeah, let me get Colin in. Colin, come on in here.
To tip international opinion in his favor, Bush knew that he needed the most respected member of his clan. National hero Colin Powell would put his moral and political credibility on the line in a last-ditch attempt to bring the United Nations on board. He would explain to the world why America wanted war at all costs. Powell wrote his speech with the help of Director of the CIA, George Tenet. The two men shut themselves away for 5 days and 5 nights. Larry Wilkerson was with them.
Secretary Powell had told me I want at least 3 or 4 sources, each independently corroborating the other, for every major statement I'm going to make. And what he meant by that, of course, was he wanted human intelligence, he wanted materials intelligence, he wanted satellite intelligence, photo reconnaissance intelligence. He wanted some form of intelligence that, independent of this one, corroborated this one.
But during those long nights, they realized that Tenet had nothing new to offer. They'd have to make do with what they'd got.
But I quickly found out that what George meant by checking sources was him. He was speaking as the DCI for the entire intelligence community. And so every time we had a question about a source, it was take my word. It was, yeah, this is a good source. It was, yes, this is okay.
Colin Powell became angry when Tenet asked him to take his word for it.
I want a photo of this damn thing. I mean, he told the DCI that. I don't want to draw sketches of a biological laboratory. I want a photograph. If it's a rail car, get me a photograph. If it's a truck, I want a photograph. And, you know, George Tenet couldn't produce those things. If you're the Secretary of State, you've got to take the DCI's word for it at some points.
Late on the fifth night, in the upper floors of the United Nations building, as he was rehearsing the speech for the last time, Powell suddenly paused.
And he turned to Mr. Tenet and he said, you stand by everything I've just said. You stand by everything I've just said. Yes, I stand by it. And Powell said, well, good, because you're going to be with me tomorrow. You're going to be in camera. You're going to be with me. And that's very unusual for the director of the CIA to be on television. And you look at that presentation and he's right over Powell's shoulder. He's sitting right behind Powell.
The Iraqis are moving not just documents and hard drives, but weapons of mass destruction to keep them from being found
In the hallowed hall of the United Nations, the show could begin. Powell politely reminded gathered members that some of the details would be hard to understand.
The photos that I am about to show you are sometimes hard for the average person to interpret, hard for me.
He presented Iraq as a satanic power and accused Saddam of converting the most serious sicknesses on the planet into weapons of war.
Causing diseases such as gas gangrene, plague, typhus, tetanus, cholera, camelpox, and hemorrhagic fever. Second, when Iraq finally admitted having these weapons in 1995, the quantities were vast. Less than a teaspoon of dry anthrax, a little bit about this amount. This is just about the amount of
Like a perfect traveling salesman in the lying trade, Powell brought all the visual aids required, continuing his performance with a presentation of hand-painted mobile biological laboratories produced by the CIA thanks to the evidence of an Iraqi taxi driver whom Tenet had considered unreliable.
Highly detailed and extremely accurate.
No laboratory, mobile or otherwise, would ever be discovered.
This video of an Iraqi test flight shows an Iraqi F-1 Mirage jet aircraft. Note the spray coming from beneath the Mirage. That is 2,000 liters of simulated anthrax that a jet is spraying. In 1995,
the Mirage F-1 in this footage had been destroyed years earlier, in 1991. The sites that were claimed to be stocking chemical weapons were visited by UN inspectors during the following days and were found empty. In a speech lasting 1 hour, Powell had destroyed a reputation built over a lifetime.
In this council chamber, debating Resolution 1441 last fall.
On March 19, 2003, hostilities could begin. Let us look at the last piece of manipulation in this story. As the Americans entered Baghdad, this footage was shown again and again.
As they rolled into Baghdad, the American troops were cheered by hundreds of Iraqis gathering in the streets. In the city center, newly liberated Iraqis toppled a huge statue of Saddam Hussein.
The sequence was sold by the media as symbolizing the end of the war, though it had only just begun.
And terror.
But supposing we look more closely at the Iraqis first of all. This wide shot, filmed earlier in the day, shows that there were few of them, and that they were vainly trying to knock down the statue with sledgehammers. Then, on the left of the picture, we see the arrival of the American tank regiment. Peter Mass was in Baghdad for the New York Times.
The commander of this battalion, who I was with at the time, he saw what was going on, and he knew that the press was broadcasting all of this live. And he saw that the Iraqis were trying to take down the statue with the rope, and they had failed.
So the American general decided to give history a nudge.
Imagery can be a tactic, you know? He called his commander. The commander said, okay, just be sure that nobody gets killed when you take it down.
The tank tugged, the statue crashed to the ground, and the world was overjoyed. It was a day on which everyone needed some good news.
And I think what the cameras didn't pick up was, even while that was going on at the square, only a few blocks away, there were buildings that had been set on fire, and people were walking off with office furniture and things like that. So just very, very close to where that scene of jubilation was, the chaos was already starting to take over the city.
It was a day that would also be remembered as a victory for the Iraqi people, thanks to American intervention.
We create images that we want to believe in, and then we believe them. We create the events that confirm our desires, that confirm our prejudices.
The fallen statue was to help the American president seal his victory. But propaganda needs a receptive public, and as the weeks passed, no weapons of mass destruction could be found. This time, no manipulation could come to the aid of the Bush administration. The dejection that hung over Iraq now spread to Washington.
And former U.S. ambassador to the West African country of Gabon, Joseph Wilson, says yes. He's disclosed publicly for the first time
Joe Wilson
this
knew
morning
that the
in a
government
New York
had used his
Times op-ed
Niger
that he
visit
was
to
sent by
manipulate
Joins
public
us
opinion.
exclusively this
He
morning.
organized a
Ambassador
mediatized
Wilson, welcome.
response.
Thanks for coming in.
Morning, Andrea.
Let's put this in
So on
context.
Sunday morning, the 6th, Dick Cheney awakens. He's got Joe Wilson in the Washington Post. He's got Joe Wilson in the New York Times. He's got Joe Wilson on Meet the Press. What they were concerned about was that this was an orchestrated pushback by the CIA, because they were beginning to blame the CIA for not having come up with proof of the existence of the WMD.
To take revenge on Wilson, the vice president's office threw his wife's name to the press.
One of the nation's most carefully guarded secrets, the identity of a covert CIA agent, Valerie Plame Wilson.
Years later, a judicial inquiry condemned Cheney's chief of staff to a suspended prison sentence for having revealed the identity of an American secret agent.
It never dawned on me, because it doesn't happen, that their tactic would be to betray the identity of a covert CIA officer, or even to bring a family member into the public square to administer this beatdown, basically, this attack.
So it felt, as I have said, it felt a little bit like falling down Alice's rabbit hole. All your touchstones, everything that you've known is gone. It's wiped away.
The spy, betrayed by her own people, was left with the nightmare of Alice in Wonderland and with a shattered career.
But at the end of the day, the person who really decided to do this war was George Bush. The person who really wanted to do this war was George Bush. Now, maybe he came to that conclusion by having been manipulated, but it wasn't Dick Cheney, and it wasn't Don Rumsfeld, and it wasn't Paul Wolfowitz. At the end of the day, he wanted to do this, and he's the reason it happened.
For Iraq, the result was a 10-year war and hundreds of thousands of deaths. For George Bush, who had forever associated manipulation and military invasion with the history of his country, there was only one punishment: re-election in 2004.